Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the first section for the 8th module of the History of Christianity 2 course. In the previous modules, we looked at some revivals in Britain in the 18th century, and now in this section, we'll look at the same basic revival as it happened in the English colonies in North America. In this section, we're looking at what had become known as the First Great Awakening. The British Evangelical Revival and the First Great Awakening are actually two parts of a revival that was happening on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, involving some of the same leaders and experiences. So in this section, we'll concentrate on this revival in the American colonies. It was a genuine revival that impacted all 13 of the original colonies and shaped the United States, the country which those colonies would eventually become. We'll look at what happened and also circle back to examine some of the main people and ideas. But first, let's look at the timeline to connect these events with the events we've already studied. Jonathan Edwards lived from 1703 through 1758. The first major revival in Northampton, Massachusetts, broke out in 1734 through 1735. In 1737, Jonathan Edwards published A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God to describe this revival. In 1737 also, George Whitefield traveled to Georgia, his first trip to the New World. In 1739 through 1741, Whitefield made a preaching tour throughout the American colonies. Revival continued on and off for the next few decades, and in 1770, Whitefield died in Massachusetts while on a preaching tour there. Now let's look in detail at the events of what later became called the First Great Awakening. First, it was called the First Great Awakening because it was great, it was very significant, and it was an awakening, a reviving of the church in the various colonies back to a vibrancy of life that had been lost. And it's called the First Great Awakening because there is a Second Great Awakening that we'll study in the next section. But keep in mind, the First Great Awakening is the same general work of God as the Evangelical Revival in Britain. They happened at roughly the same time, just on different sides of the ocean. In order to understand these events, let's briefly survey the events that led up to them. In the History of Christianity 1 course, we looked at the exploration of the New World, first by the Spanish and Portuguese, but later the English also explored and formed colonies in what is now Canada and the United States. And because of the persecution of Puritans under James I and Charles I, many of the people who left England for the American colonies did it for the sake of more religious freedom. Puritanism was one of the founding principles of some of the American colonies, especially Massachusetts. The Mayflower Compact is a textbook definition of their religious and social goals. There was a sense of divine mission in the colonies. They spoke of themselves as an elect nation and a city on a hill with a divine mission from God to create a Christian civilization out of the wilderness and to evangelize the natives and then the rest of the world. The Pilgrim governor William Bradford once wrote, "As one small candle may light 1,000, so the light here kindled has shone unto many, yea, in some sort to our whole nation." But over time, this excitement and zeal grew less as the colonies grew more prosperous. There was a waning of spirituality and an increase in the destructive ideas of deism and Unitarianism. And the Calvinism of the original Pilgrims lost ground to the ideas of Arminianism, and the age of so-called Enlightenment brought increased skepticism and secularism. So there were low times in the churches, but still with a good memory of strong times and solid godly principles. And there were many precursors to revival in the 1720s. There were many pastors recognizing the deadness of many churches and the coldness and sometimes even lack of conversion in the clergy. And so they called the church back to faithfulness and repentance and prayed for revival. There were many pastors who contributed as leaders in the First Great Awakening, but the two most important figures were George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. We'll come back to look at them in more detail, but I mention them now in order to describe what happened. Edwards began to experience revival in his church in Northampton, Massachusetts. In 1733 and 1734, there were about 30 conversions a week for an extended period of time. These, what Edwards labeled as surprising conversions, they began when he preached a sermon series called Justification by Faith Alone. Now, he did not call these conversions surprising in the sense that Edwards didn't believe in revival or conversion. They were not surprising in the sense that Edwards wasn't seeking revival. Edwards had been working toward and praying for the kind of revival that happened. What was surprising about them was that Edwards was doing nothing different. There was nothing out of the ordinary on the church's part that would explain the extraordinary revival happening. He had always been preaching, praying, and working for revival. Just at that particular time, God had chosen to work in a special way. In describing this revival, Edwards wrote that it was a special dispensation of God's providence. He said, "When God in so remarkable a manner took the work into his own hands, there was as much done in a day or two as at ordinary times, with all the endeavors that men can use, and with such a blessing as we commonly have, is done in a year." And these conversions were often accompanied with deep emotions. People were groaning, screaming, and crying under the conviction of sin, and also expressing great joy at their sense of forgiveness and conversion. There was also a typical sense of struggling through conversion. It was typically a time-consuming process, often drawn out over days or weeks. But because of this struggle, those conversion experiences typically proved to be genuine and bore fruit in godliness. And Edwards wrote 2 books to describe this first wave of revival. The first was titled A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God. This simply described what had happened and defended it as a genuine work of God. Isaac Watts published this in England and wrote in his introduction, "Wheresoever God works with power for salvation upon the minds of men, there will be some discoveries of a sense of sin, of the danger of the wrath of God, and the all-sufficiency of his Son Jesus, to relieve us under all our spiritual wants and distresses, and a hearty consent of soul to receive him in the various offices of grace. It is the common plain Protestant doctrine of the Reformation, without stretching towards antinomians on the one side or the Arminians on the other, that the Spirit of God has been pleased to honor with such illustrious success." And Edwards also wrote a book called The Distinguishing Marks of the Work of the Spirit of God, to defend this revival against its detractors. We'll come back to look at each of those 2 books in more detail in a moment, but I want to continue with the history now. In 1740, revival broke out again under the leadership and preaching of Edwards and George Whitefield, who was preaching throughout the colonies. And this revival spread to all 13 of the colonies. It's estimated that around 30 to 40,000 people were converted between 1740 and 1743. And about 150 new churches were started in various places. This revival also brought much opposition from preachers in established churches who feared the enthusiasm and overt emotionalism seen in the revivals. Now, Edwards saw the need both to defend the genuine revival and to protect it from letting the enthusiasm get out of hand. He had the attitude that it's about Jesus, not enthusiasm. And he took pains to examine and explain what kinds of enthusiasm were godly and appropriate responses to Jesus, and what kinds were counterfeit and or distraction away from the true Jesus. Now, that's a short survey of what happened at the time. Now, let's look at the activities of the 2 main leaders in more detail. We've already met George Whitefield in the last section. He was also a major player in the British evangelical revival, and I won't repeat that part of his story here. Whitefield basically split his time between Britain and America, sailing back and forth regularly. He founded an orphanage in Georgia after the pattern learned from Auguste Franca, and Whitefield continued his pattern of being a traveling preacher in America. He preached whenever he had an opportunity. And he also preached without hesitation to slaves and Native Americans. And just like in England, Whitefield was a very effective preacher, and masses were converted. Wherever he went, revival seemed to follow. Thousands came to see him preach, and thousands were saved. Now, there are many stories of people traveling miles and miles just to hear him preach. And there's a story of a man who, while Whitefield was preaching, this man stood off to the side and mockingly imitated Whitefield's mannerisms. And while he was sarcastically mimicking the sermon in a silly manner for the amusement of his fellow mockers, the meaning of what he was saying suddenly dawned on him, and he was converted on the spot. And Whitefield was also a man of prayer. He typically spent hours in prayer before preaching. And interesting, Whitefield was a friend of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin published many of his sermons and loved to hear him preach. Someone once asked Franklin why he went to hear Whitefield preach, because he said, "You don't believe in Christ." But Franklin replied, "I go because he most certainly does." Franklin testified that Whitefield was a thoroughly honest man. And Franklin also wrote in his own autobiography about the impact which Whitefield had made. Franklin wrote, "It was wonderful to see the change soon made by his preaching in the manners of the inhabitants. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families on every street." And finally, Whitefield apparently didn't care about getting credit or fame for all the ministry success of the revival. He once said, "Let the name of George Whitefield perish so long as Christ is exalted." And the second main leader of the First Great Awakening was Jonathan Edwards. He has sometimes been called an American Puritan. He lived generations later, but was insulated from the trend away from Puritanism in England because he lived in the wilderness on the other side of the ocean. So Edwards was still living with the Puritan mindset, while still being conversant with later Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke. Edwards is probably most famous for his sermon, "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God," which I highly recommend reading. And he's also called America's greatest theologian. He's also known as a profound philosopher, although he would not have made a distinction between theology and philosophy because his philosophy was so God-centered. Edwards was born in 1703, and he became fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew by the age of 13. And he attended Yale and graduated at the head of his class in 1720. If you do the math, he graduated from Yale at the head of his class at the age of 17. Edwards was an extremely intelligent man. Now, let me quote from his own personal narrative to tell about his conversion. He wrote that he was strongly impacted with a sense of the glory of the divine being, a new sense quite different from anything I ever experienced before. I thought with myself how excellent a being that was, and how happy I should be if I might enjoy that God. And throughout the rest of his personal narrative, Edwards described his experience of delight in God and in the things of God. He wrote, "I have often had sweet complacency in God in view of his glorious perfections and the excellency of Jesus Christ. God has appeared to me a glorious and lovely being, chiefly on the account of his holiness. And the person of Christ appeared ineffably excellent, with an excellency great enough to swallow up all thought and conception." And he wrote about his change in views about God's sovereignty. He once said, "From my childhood up, my mind had been full of objections against the doctrine of God's sovereignty. I've often since not only had a conviction, but a delightful conviction. The doctrine of God's sovereignty has very often appeared an exceedingly pleasant, bright, and sweet doctrine to me. And absolute sovereignty is what I love to ascribe to God." Now, early in his life, he wrote out a list of what he called his resolutions. These are personal rules and goals that he set for himself that guided his life. Let me give you a taste of just a few of them. Number 1, he said, resolved that I will do whatsoever I think to be most to God's glory. And number 5, resolved never to lose one moment of time, but improve it the most profitable way I possibly can. Number 6, resolved to live with all my might while I do live. Number 28, resolved to study the scriptures so steadily, constantly, and frequently as that I might find and plainly perceive myself to grow in the knowledge of them. And number 30, resolved to strive to my utmost every week to be brought higher in religion and to a higher exercise of grace than I was the week before. Now, I've assigned an article on the resolutions of Edwards as a supplementary reading for this section, and you'll find the link in the course syllabus as well as in the material for this module. And one more quote to give you a sense of his mindset. Edwards said, I go out to preach with 2 propositions in mind. First, every person ought to give his life to Christ. And second, whether or not anyone else gives him his life, I will give him mine. All that gives you an idea of what kind of man Jonathan Edwards was in private. Now let's look at his public ministry. He studied divinity and became a Presbyterian minister in New York City for a short time, and then he became associate pastor under his maternal grandfather named Solomon Stoddard in Northampton, Massachusetts. And he became the head pastor of that church when Stoddard died in 1729. And in Northampton, he experienced revival in various waves throughout the 1730s and 40s. As I mentioned, this came out of his normal pastoral work there. Edwards was actually noted for his relatively bland preaching style. He was not dramatic or exciting at all in his delivery, but the content he proclaimed was so exciting and dramatic that people responded. Then later on, he was actually fired from the church in Northampton over his strong exercise of church discipline, and because he insisted on Christian conversion and Christian life before Christian membership. He was treated extremely unfairly by church politics, but he took it well and humbly. He moved on to a place called Stockbridge in Massachusetts, where he was a frontier pastor and missionary to the natives from 1751 to 1758. And he wrote his greatest theological and philosophical books at that time. Then, because of his accomplishments and obvious qualifications, both in the revival and in his writing, he was invited to be the president of the College of New Jersey, which would later be named Princeton. And as part of the preparation for starting that job, he was given an immunization against smallpox, but he actually died from it a week later. That's a brief biography of Jonathan Edwards. Now I want to survey some of his writings, which are probably his greatest long-term influence. Most are still in print over 200 years later, and some are still being edited in order to be published for the first time. Like Luther and Calvin, and many others before him, all of his writings came from within a pastoral and missionary context. He wasn't writing to impress academics or to sell books. He was writing to help people to know and serve Christ better. And that came out even in his dense philosophical writings. And I'll divide his writings into 2 main categories. First are his writings about the revival. As I mentioned earlier, he wrote an account of the revival of 1734 and 1735, called A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God. This opened people to the possibility and process of this type of conversion, and it opened the revival to a larger and wider influence. His account of the revival was also a partial cause of further revival, when people got excited and prayed for it to happen where they lived. And like I mentioned, it was printed in England, and that set fire partly as a reason for the British evangelical revival. Then he also wrote a work called The Distinguishing Marks of a Work of the Spirit of God. That was written to answer the objections to the revival and some of its expressions. He started that book from the text in 1 John 4:1, which says, "Test the spirits, whether they are from God." And from that starting point, he asked two questions. First, how do we know whether a revival is really the work of God? And in answer to that first question, he started by listing and describing some things that are not evidence or are inconclusive evidence. In other words, these things he listed do not prove one way or the other that it is or it is not from God. And he listed and elaborated, it is unusual or extraordinary. Then it produces bodily effects like tears, groanings, and outcries. And people make outward noise about religion. And it makes a great impression on people's imaginations. And it follows from other people's example and pattern. And it results in what Edwards called imprudence. That is what we would call fanaticism or zeal. And it is intermixed with errors of judgment or works of Satan. If some who are thought to be converted fall away into gross error or scandalous practice, or it is promoted by threatening terrors of God's holy law. Now, all of these things, Edwards argued, could be true of a genuine revival to some extent, but they could also be true of a counterfeit from the devil. Yes, people certainly can get excited when God is working in their lives, but they can also get excited at a football game. So excitement is not conclusive evidence either way, and same for everything on this list. They don't prove that it is a revival, but they also don't prove that it's not. It's inconclusive. But then Edwards went on to provide what he called distinguishing marks, that is, conclusive evidence that it is a genuine work of God. And this is the list he gave of those. First, it raises people's esteem of Jesus. They love and think more highly of him. Second, it works against Satan's kingdom and sin. People sin less and they don't fall for the devil's lies. Third, it causes people to have greater regard for holy scriptures. People love and read and trust the Bible more. It becomes more and more of a functional authority in their life. Fourth, it is a spirit of truth, leading people to truth and convincing them that it is true. That people care about the truth, pursue it, and actually find and embrace it as true. And finally, it causes love to God and man. The people actually love God more and love their neighbor more in a godly manner. All of these things, Edwards argued, they don't come natural to unregenerate humans, and the devil would never fake these things. So if they happen, that is solid evidence that God is at work. And at this point, it's appropriate to examine if you can find that kind of evidence in your own life. Now, all of that was addressing Edwards' first question, how do we know a genuine revival from a fake one? But then he goes on to his second question, based on that standard, does this present revival pass the test? And he answered, yes, it does, without question. He wrote, the extraordinary influence that has lately appeared, causing an uncommon concern and engagedness of mind about the things of religion, is undoubtedly, in the general, from the Spirit of God. And from that, he warned people, don't oppose what God is doing. Rather, be a part of it and try to help it. And to those who are already a part of it, he said, be careful not to act in a way that would discredit it or become a stumbling block to hinder it. That's a summary of his book, The Distinguishing Marks. And I've also included a written summary of that book as part of the supplementary material for this module. And Edwards later wrote another narrative book called An Account of the Revival of Religion in Northampton, 1740 through 1742. And this book is similar to the faithful narrative of the surprising work of God in that it is a narrative account, but you might have noticed from the title that it describes the later wave of revival that happened in 1740 to 42, which included the influence of George Whitefield. And then his work called The Religious Affections. This is a very similar approach and expansion of the ideas of the distinguishing marks. That is, how we know whether our conversion is genuine. And this book has 3 parts. First, concerning the nature of the affections and their importance in religion. That is, Edwards described what he means by the term affections and why they are important. This is similar to one of the things that Augustine emphasized. Then second, showing what are no certain signs that religious affections are truly gracious or that they are not. And third, showing what are distinguishing signs of truly gracious and holy affections. Like in the distinguishing marks, he listed and described what is not conclusive one way or the other, and then what is. And the conclusive evidence is in our affections. The people genuinely love God for who he is and delight in him in Christ, which naturally works out to change lives as we pursue what we truly desire and are conformed to him and his revelation. In other words, Edwards tried to get head and heart together for God. He wrote, I should think myself in the way of my duty to raise the affections of my hearers as high as possibly I can, provided that they are affected with nothing but truth and with affections that are not disagreeable to the nature of what they are affected with. Now, the book Religious Affections, this is not an easy read, but it's a classic and I highly recommend it. And Edwards wrote a number of theological and philosophical works as well. One is called On the Freedom of the Will. The subtitle of that work is A Careful and Strict Enquiry into the Modern Prevailing Notions of that Freedom of Will which is supposed to be essential to moral agency, virtue, and vice, reward and punishment, praise and blame. That book is an argument against Arminianism. Edwards wrote that Arminianism was insisting on free will, but they were confused and incoherent about what they are insisting. He drew on Augustine's categories and asked, do we choose arbitrarily, without reasons? Or are we constrained from carrying out our choices? Are we forced to will against our will? And then he argued for a more practical understanding of our will and its level of freedom and significance. He also wrote a book called The Christian Doctrine of Original Sin Defended, and this book also argued against the Arminianism of his time, obviously by teaching about the doctrine of original sin and its implications for that debate. And one of his most ambitious books is called The End for Which God Created the World. In that book, he tried to communicate why God created everything. Edwards argued that everything exists for the purpose of the display and experience of the glory of God. He was careful to guard against the thought that creation somehow fills a need in God, so that creation is somehow necessary in itself. Rather, he wrote that creation is the overflow of the glory of God with a purpose that is not about creation, but creation's purpose is about God. Here's a small example from that book. He wrote, the emanation or communication of the divine fullness consisting in the knowledge of God, love to him, and joy in him has relation indeed both to God and the creature, but it has relation to God as its fountain. And again, they have relation to God as their object. In the creature's knowing, esteeming, loving, rejoicing in, and praising God, the glory of God is both exhibited and acknowledged. His fullness is received and returned. The beams of glory come from God, are something of God, and are refunded back again to their original, so that the whole is of God, and in God, and to God, and he is the beginning and the middle and the end. In other words, he wrote, creation exists not because God needs it, but because God is so great and glorious that he overflows to create things to display and reflect his glory. And in another famous book called The Nature of True Virtue, Edwards argued that self-love is confined and narrow and selfish, and any human love is not virtuous until it embraces or delights in the good of the whole universe of being. Or more simply, until it embraces God. Until self-love rises to the level of embracing God, it embraces what Edwards described as an infinitely small part of universal existence. The only public life of an evangelical that counts as virtuous is one that savors and celebrates the supremacy of God as the ground and goal of its public acts. In other words, for Edwards, to love our neighbor and do good things for our neighbor, that's not enough to be virtuous, because we often do this for selfish reasons, expecting to get good things from our neighbor. And love to our neighbor is far too small. We're to love God first, and in one sense, exclusively. And then, and only then, will our love for our neighbor actually be virtuous and effective. All right, that's just a taste of some of his theological and philosophical writings. He wrote many more that we did not cover, and I recommend reading Edwards. He wrote some deep philosophical stuff, but it's still readable and profitable for the average Christian, and is totally worth the effort. Because Edwards is always God-centered and God-honoring. If you want a vision of a great God, read Edwards. Now I want to try to summarize the mindset and attitude of Jonathan Edwards, which caused all of his ministry and writings. Edwards was thoroughly God-centered in his worldview and its expressions. When I say God-centered, I also mean Christ-centered. I mean God-centered as opposed to man-centered or self-centered. Edwards thought holistically and saw all things in their relation to the universal, which is God himself. For Edwards, everything is seen in relation to God. God's nature, his purposes, and his actions. For Edwards, the triune God is the center of all of reality and history. For instance, when he studied history or nature, Edwards asked, how is this connected to God? He tried to learn about, for instance, plants by asking how they were an expression of God's nature and plan. He tried to see everything through God's eyes and purpose and revelation. And that's the opposite of what we saw in the Middle Ages, where natural theology tried to understand God by looking at nature. Edwards flipped that and tried to understand nature by looking at God. And not just nature, but all of life, including humanity and all of our psychology and relationships, both public and private. These were all seen from a God-centered perspective. And for Edwards, the Bible was his primary and functional authority. He once wrote, God would have our whole dependence be upon the Scriptures, because the greater our dependence is upon the Word of God, the more direct and immediate is our dependence on God himself. For Edwards, God is the ultimate cause of our salvation. He's the prime mover and actor in every individual's salvation. As I mentioned earlier, Edwards argued against Arminianism, and he was a convinced Calvinist with a high view of God's sovereignty, not just in salvation, but in every part of life. And for Edwards, God is the focus of our salvation. The core activity of genuine spiritual life is to delight in the excellencies of God. The essence of spiritual life is to be God-centered, to delight in the greatness of God and live all of life with him at the center. And for Edwards, God is the goal of our salvation. The goal and final end of a truly spiritual life is to delight in the excellencies of God. He wrote, people ought to be endeavoring by all possible ways to inflame their desires and to obtain more spiritual pleasures. Our hungerings and thirstings after God and Jesus Christ and after holiness can't be too great for the value of these things, for they are of infinite value. Therefore, endeavor to promote spiritual appetites by laying yourself in the way of allurement. There's no such thing as excess in our taking of this spiritual food. There's no such virtue as temperance in spiritual feasting. In other words, we will be delighting in God for all eternity, so that is what we should be pursuing without limits, even in this life. And Edwards, like the Puritans before him, closely connected the head and the heart and the hands. He connected our intellectual grasp of the truth with our affections delighting in the truth. We love God with our mind and with our heart, which flows out into our actions. And that also means that we know things not just with our mind, but also with our passionate experiences. He wrote, "There is a twofold knowledge of good, of which God has made the mind of man capable. The first, that which is merely notional, and the other is that which consists in the sense of the heart, as when the heart is sensible of pleasure and delight in the presence of the idea of it. In the former is exercised merely the understanding, in distinction from the disposition of the soul. Thus there is a difference between having an opinion that God is holy and gracious, and having a sense of the loveliness and beauty of that holiness and grace. There's a difference between having a rational judgment that honey is sweet and having a sense of its sweetness. A man may have the former that knows not how honey tastes, but a man cannot have the latter unless he has an idea of the taste of honey in his mind." Edwards wanted both to know that God is good and to taste and see that he is good by experience and to live it out. Now, all of that is a biographical sketch of two of the main leaders of the First Great Awakening. There were many other important leaders, but there's no time to talk about them, I'm sorry. But there were also many parish ministers who followed up and kept the revival going after the famous preachers left town, and their contribution should not be forgotten. Now, let's summarize the results of the First Great Awakening. First, it was a genuine revival. People were saved. Churches were strengthened and revived. Many denominations saw significant growth, and colleges were started to train pastors. There was some counterfeit work and fanaticism. There were emotional outbursts and some disruptions, and there were spurious conversions where people's life did not really change. Edwards' writings sought to weed out the good from the bad. But in the First Great Awakening, the good far outweighed the bad. However, there were also some tensions between the revival and some of the established churches. There was some anti-intellectualism and anti-tradition in the revival, and there was some resistance to change in the established churches. But again, the good overshadowed the bad by far. And there was also a breaking down of denominational barriers, as people in churches from a variety of denominational backgrounds found unity in the experience of revival. There was cooperation between churches and denominations. There was a high level of involvement from lay people and not just clergy. And there was also a breaking down of class and race barriers. The revival cut across class, gender, and racial divides. The leaders preached to anybody and everybody. They preached to slaves, to former slaves, and to natives. They preached to rich and poor. They preached in the big cities, and they preached in the middle of nowhere. And there was a breaking down of barriers between the separate colonies. The First Great Awakening was the first experience that was common to all 13 of the original colonies. Before that time, they basically thought of themselves like different countries. But the awakening was a unifying factor. And many historians cite this as a major unifying factor that led to American independence. It unified all the 13 colonies in a common experience, and therefore into a common identity. And like I mentioned, there were political consequences as well. The First Great Awakening was just decades before the American Revolution, and the effects of the awakening were still very much around at the time of independence. Now, I don't think the awakening was the direct cause of American independence, but it had a decisive role in preventing revolutionary aftermath in the break from England. There is a dramatic contrast between the aftermath of the American Revolution and the horrible aftermath of the French Revolution, which happened a decade later. That is because these were two different kinds of revolutions. because they were built on two different foundations. The American Revolution wanted to return to the proper authority, which ultimately is God. The Declaration of Independence says the Creator has more authority than King George. But the French Revolution wanted to do away with all higher authority and put all authority in the human collective. And that ended in bloodshed, anarchy, and dictatorship, which that kind of revolutionary mindset always does. The French Revolution wanted to tear down everything in order to build on some nebulous humanist ideology, but the American Revolution wanted to continue building on what had already gone before. And the American Revolution was built on the foundation of a genuine revival. And so the new nation started, filled with the concept of a godly nation, a chosen nation to be a light to the world, demonstrating a new kind of nation. All right, now let's review. The First Great Awakening was a genuine revival from God, where he brought renewed life to his church. It was part of the same movement as the British Evangelical Revival, just in North America. It started with surprising conversions, and it spread through writings that narrated the awakening, and it spread through traveling evangelists. We examined the ministry of two main leaders, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, and the awakening had many lasting results. And that brings us to a few questions for discussion and application. And the first two will bring in the supplemental readings. First, based on the summary of the distinguishing marks by Edwards, why do you think each of the marks listed are listed as conclusive or non-conclusive marks? Why did Edwards think that the non-conclusive marks not enough to certainly demonstrate a genuine conversion or revival? And why do you think Edwards listed each of the conclusive marks as demonstrating a genuine work of God? Do you agree with Edwards' assessment of each of these marks? Why or why not? Is there anything you would add or take away from that list? If so, what and why? How do the concepts and ideas of this work inform your life and ministry goals? How do these things apply to you personally? Second, based on Edwards' resolutions, which of the resolutions stood out to you as most important and applicable to you right now? Why did it stand out? Why do you think this is a good resolution that you want to follow? And how will you apply this insight? What other concepts did you gain from the resolutions? Describe how your life would be different if you had the same kind of attitude and lifestyle reflected in those resolutions. Describe some ways you intend to put this kind of attitude and lifestyle into practice. Third, describe what you learned about the First Great Awakening. What happened and why? What difference did it make? What principles can you learn from this history that are applicable to your own situation? How do you intend to apply these insights in your own life and ministry? And fourth, what did you learn from the life and ministry of George Whitefield and/or Jonathan Edwards? Describe their attitudes, goals, and actions. How were their lives a product of their context? How did their lives impact their context? What things in their life stood out to you as worthy of imitation? Why was it good, and how can you do something similar? What stood out as something to avoid? How can you protect yourself from a similar shortcoming? How should your life change for the better based on what you've learned about Whitefield and/or Edwards? And finally is the open-ended question. What else did you learn from this section? And how is it applicable in your own life and ministry? All right, now is the time to pause for discussion and processing the First Great Awakening using these questions. Feel free to pause the video to work through these things. And when you're ready, come back and we'll go through some guiding principles that we can learn. So pause the video now. Now we're back for some guiding principles, which I hope you will take to heart from the First Great Awakening. First, I suggest we pursue genuine revival. We should long for it. We should believe it can happen. And we should know that we desperately need it. Now, we also need to be clear about what we can and cannot do. I can't create life. I can't bring life back from the dead. Only God can do that. Not even the best medical doctor has the power of life and death. But a good doctor can do things that promote life and fend off the things that bring death, like medicine and physical training. We should do our part, but we should also expect God to do his part in his perfect timing. Only God can bring genuine life. Jesus told a parable in Mark chapter 4 about a farmer who planted seeds, and then the seeds grew when the farmer was asleep and when he was awake, because the life was in the seed and not dependent on the farmer. And Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. So we should do what we can, but we should pray that God will grace us with renewed life. And we should work towards it as much as within our power, with an attitude of expectancy that God will do his part. We might be surprised that the revival comes when it does, but we should not be surprised that it does, because we've been asking for it and pursuing it. Second, we should pursue revival in the church and evangelism in the world. Just like in the British revival, the First Great Awakening started in the churches, bringing them back to the fullness of life, and then worked out into evangelism. We should still proclaim the gospel to almost Christians already in our midst, and renewal in churches also raises up new workers for the harvest. But it should never remain in the churches. We also need to go out to where the people are and tell them the good news of Christ. The typical pattern is that a renewed church sees the renewed fruitfulness in evangelism outside the church. Now, however, I admit that I've gotten ahead of myself. We should seek for revival to start in our own lives. Let it start with you. Let it start with me. Revival will get rid of sin, or sin will get rid of revival. Therefore, repent and put sin to death in your own life, and follow Christ with all of your heart, holding nothing back. Just like Whitefield and Edwards pursued holiness, which made them worthy vessels for God to use. In the same way, we should seek holiness as we seek revival, because they both go together. Not that we work for or earn revival and holiness, but we go in faith to Christ, who gives these good things to those who ask. And fourth, I suggest that we discern genuine revival, because not everything that claims to be from God actually is from God. Not everything that is called revival really is. Just like in those days, there are still plenty of counterfeits. So I suggest that we learn from the wisdom of Edwards and distinguish what is evidence of a true work of God and what is not, and then use those godly wise measurements to discern what God is doing and where we should follow and where we should not. Fifth, we also should be God-centered. Let us imitate the First Great Awakening and make it about God in Christ. A whole lot more than we make it about ourselves. Have the attitude and mindset that the world exists for God's glory, not mine, because it does. Have the attitude and mindset that Jesus is the center of the universe, not us, because he is. Let us live all our lives, not asking God how God can fit into our lives, but asking how we fit into God's life, and how we can live in every situation in a way that is mindful of God and pleasing to him. And finally, let us experience unifying cooperation with other Christians and churches. Let us unify around what God is actually doing, and not on some humanly manufactured facade of unity. That means we unify around truth and goodness without compromise. We can work side by side with others who genuinely know Christ and work for his glory according to his revelation. But we don't need to work with others who don't love Christ. That's not real unity. But pursuing Christ will bring us closer to others who are also pursuing Christ. All right, those are some of the things that I hope we will learn from the First Great Awakening. And there are many other things that we were not able to cover in the limited scope of this section. But I hope this has given you an overview understanding of this history and a desire to learn more. And I pray this has given you a vision for the kind of things that God is still able to do, even in our messed up society. And I pray that He gives you the motivation to do your part to see revival in your situation. Now, all along, we've called this part of the history the First Great Awakening, and as I mentioned, that strongly implies that there was a Second Great Awakening. Well, there was, and that is the topic of the next section, and I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for watching.